now.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Naquan McLean, and I'm the president of the Education Council Consortium. And tonight we are here with a great presentation on a dashboard workshop. I'm going to turn it over to Anna Minsky, who will introduce the presenters for tonight, and we will move right on in our presentation. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Naquan. Really happy to be here with everyone. And this project started out when I was on a school leadership team. And, we were talking about the budget, kind of, sort of, or not, but I wanted to encourage the other, particularly parent members on the SLT, to take a look at the budget. And there's budget data that's, open to anyone on the DOE website. And I started copying it all into a spreadsheet and making some little charts. And then Stacy Johnson, another ECC member, had the idea because she was taking a class at the time with someone from Beta NYC, that maybe we could do something more with those charts. And I started talking with Eric, who's here on the call now, and we spun it up, or I shouldn't say we, really, they spun it up into a dashboard that's kind of based on that original idea, and something that I hope will be useful to other parents on SLTs. So I'm going to turn it over to Audrey and to Ashley, who are data dashboard wizards, to show you what we've got.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, my name is Ashley. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Chief Technology Officer of Beta NYC. And on the call today, we also have Eric Brown, our former lab manager, and Audrey Leung, who is an associate in the lab. Audrey and Eric both were really pivotal in working on this project. So thank you, and we're excited to share this tool with you all today. So a little bit about us, and Audrey, you can go to the next slide. We are Beta NYC. We're a civic technology nonprofit organization. We're a team of 7 full-time staff and 3 associates. And Eric was our lab manager while working on this project. He has now since moved on from Beta NYC, but we've got him in here on this slide. And next slide. As an organization, Beta NYC started around 2008 to 2009 as a meetup. Since then, we've grown as an organization in support of the open data law and to build out the infrastructure to support open data through public programs, a fellowship program, and providing research and data assistance to folks looking to get a little bit deeper into the world of data. Our mission is we are dedicated to improving lives in New York through civic design, technology, and data. We help all New Yorkers access information and use technology for public interest. Recently, we've been kind of involved in support for digital equity, and in conversations now, maybe even getting involved in supporting open data beyond the local level at all levels of governance. So that's us. Yeah. We are structured in 3 main departments. One is a fellowship and apprenticeship program, where we build a civic tech talent pipeline and host a cohort of civic innovation fellowship fellows who have historically been CUNY students, and they kind of dip their toes into the world of civics and data analytics. Our team, so that's Audrey, Eric, and myself, we all represent the Civic Innovation Lab. where we run a civic data help desk and respond to research and data assistance requests. We work with people to, just like Anna came to approach us to, dig a little bit deeper into the school budgets data. Sometimes we build tools and solutions that help people access data and information easier. And lastly, we have a public data literacy program as part of a broader public programs engagement to teach people how to use open data. So, as well as kind of generally supporting um, uh, and celebrating New York City's vast resources in open data. We also kind of co-plan the annual Open Data Week event around March and have an annual conference that terminates at the end of Open Data Week called School of Data. So those are great ways to get engaged in the future if you're curious about getting more into open data. So for today's talk, we're going to dive into this dashboard that our team has co-developed with Anna and the Education Council Consortium. We built a dashboard to help visualize New York City public school allocations and budget data. And really, we wanted a tool to be able to look at data, this like budget data in the context of years and change over time, as well as like contextualize it with some relevant terms and resources involved in really understanding this information and to be able to compare schools between different districts. So we'll get into that a little bit deeper. But this is kind of a snapshot of what we're going to be covering today. Our team also built a sort of web scraper and made all of this data available. It was already available to the public, but now it's in a nice organized spreadsheet format that can be easily downloaded. So we'll get into the details of that as we move forward with this presentation. So today's talk is structured just a quick recap on an introduction to school budget basics. There was a talk led by the ECC a few weeks ago that was really great to introduce topics of how SLTs need to dig into school budget data and why that's important. So a quick recap on that in an introduction to the dashboard, and then a deep dive into understanding and reading the visualizations included in this dashboard. Yeah, so let's get started with the school budget basics recap. So a budget is a financial plan that supports the school, its mission, and its students. So input from school leadership teams is important and required per the chancellor's regulation. And the school budget is an important part of this process. So it's a financial plan that supports the school, its mission, and its students. And the goal is to have that budget align with the school's comprehensive educational plan to make sure that, you're putting your money where your mouth is, essentially. So school funding and spending is kind of like can be seen as in two main categories. One is allocations. So it is the funding sources received from different entities, and it comes in the form of 4 categories. One is like the city level, New York City tax levy funds. It comes from New York State funds, federal funds, and as well as private donations. The budget is how the school spends that money. So it's broken down into like sometimes stipulations on you could spend it on school-based positions, goods such as computers or equipment for classrooms, as well as services. Services that are necessary to improve the school or renovations and things like that. So the goal of school leadership teams is to, review the budget to better understand whether their school is kind of in alignment with its financial resources based on the needs of the school's students. So it's like the financial plan that's put in place to support the school and its mission and its students. And as a school leadership team member, it's kind of your role to review the school budget and part of that involves, reviewing the school budget data to make sure that that's kind of in line with your school's comprehensive educational plan. So right now there are a couple tools available to dig into data. So the Department of Education has a Galaxy portal website where they publish allocations data and budget summary data online. There's also the school allocation memos data and a budget at a glance tool, which is another dashboard that helps look at an individual school's budget. But before that budget at a glance tool was developed, Anna came to Beta NYC and approached our team to help make some of the Galaxy allocations and budget summary data more accessible. So we are now introducing a fifth tool here for the New York City Public School Allocations and Budgets dashboard. So a quick intro into the dashboard. Really, again, the data is really built upon those first two data sources, which is the Galaxy allocations and the Galaxy budget summaries data. If we go to the Galaxy portal, it's a little bit challenging to access some of the data here. You can only look at one school at a time, and you can't really easily download this information. It's just in a portal on the website. So there's no way to compare your school over time. There's no way to compare how your school compares to other schools or to do a bit of deeper analysis on this information. So we built the dashboard on top of the data already publicly available in the Galaxy portal, so that deeper insights could be analyzed by SLTs. So within the dashboard, we've organized 3 main pages. The first tab kind of is the dashboard itself. There are 6 visualizations that dig into the school allocations and budgets, funding allocation categories, allocations and budget per pupil, as well as looking at pupil to staff ratios, and 2 district-wide comparisons of a particular school. And then in the second tab, we have also included a lookup table. So part of the limitations of this tool being built on a Tableau dashboard is under the hood, the data is a bit rigid in the way that it's structured. So the dashboard uses a 4-digit school code. So it has the first digit, which is like the borough code letter, and then 3 digits for the particular school. So if you don't know your school's code, you can go to this table resource and search your particular school in your borough and get that code that you need to use the dashboard. We also have an about page, which gives a high-level overview of kind of the intent of how we designed and intended this tool to be used, as well as some broader resources of like the key terms that are used in terms of like allocation categories, or what is an allocation versus what is a budget. And it's sometimes hard to keep track of all of those things. So we put together a mini resource guide page here to help navigate some of the information in the dashboard. From here, Audrey is gonna walk through a deep dive of each of the 6 visualizations included in the dashboard, so you have a better understanding of how to navigate that information, how to make sense of the meaning, put forward in the charts, and how to make that information more usable and impactful when you bring it back to your school meetings. Over to you, Audrey.
Perfect. Thanks, Ashley. So I'm about to dive into those 6 figures. And in order to do so, we're going to be looking at M125 as a case study. So first, we're going to start with those first 4 school level figures. And really the goal here is to, like Ashley said, teach you how to use and understand our dashboard tool and really promote the data literacy necessary to read these figures and make them relevant and useful to your SLTs and schools. So our first figure here is looking at allocations and budget overall. This is a pretty high level figure that summarizes those Galaxy portals. So to break this track or this overall graph down a little bit, first we're going to take a look at the legend, which shows what the graph is showing. We're focusing here on total allocations and total budget, which are total funding and spending. And we have total allocations in that dark blue line, and then total budget represented in the lighter blue line. Taking a look next here at the 2 axes. On our x-axis, we have fiscal year, which is how the budget and allocations data is posted. And we have the years 2018 to 2024 represented here. Like Ashley said, we're really focused on allowing our users to see data over time and understand how data is changing, increasing, or decreasing. And on our y-axis, we have the total allocations and budget amounts in US dollars. And so you can see here, our scale begins at a little bit over 4 million, not at 0, and then scales up to the highest amount over this period of years. Next here, we have a little bit about how to read this chart. When we think about the slope of this chart, the rise and run of the curve is showing shifts in allocations and budget per year. It's showing rates of increase and decrease in these amounts. And so we've outlined a couple of examples here. First, when we look at the periods of the 2019 to 2020 versus 2020 to 2021 school year, you might notice that this segment of the line is a lot steeper than between 2019 and 2020, which means that allocations and budget were increasing at a faster or larger rate between these 2 years versus increasing at a slower rate or to a lesser degree between 2019 and 2020. And then you can also see here overall we have an increase from 2018 to 2024 from a little bit over 4 million to 5 million. And so that's a little bit about how to read and interpret kind of the visual line that you're seeing here. Additionally, we're able to visualize in this curve what the difference between allocations and budget are per year, and this is representing surplus and deficit. So in most cases, you'll see that your allocations line in the darker blue is going to be above your budget line. And that's because schools are trying to spend no more than they're being funded, right? They don't want to go into deficit. But there are cases in which schools under allocate or under budget their money. And so they're not spending the full scope of their funding, which is due to a variety of reasons with how funding is being allocated throughout the year. And so you can see there are multiple years here where the schools have surplus. They have extra money that they didn't quite spend in their budget compared to their total allocations. And so overall, when we think about this first figure, we're really able to visualize how funding is shifting over time. And it's important to think about how this is related to student enrollment or student needs. That's how schools are being funded in many cases. And so that's what this is truly a representation of. And it's important to contextualize that if you're interested in these numbers to really research how that funding is structured. And it's also important to consider, as I mentioned, that budget planning is very complex, especially when we think about annual surplus and deficit. There's a lot of technicalities. Budget data is being updated in real time on the Galaxy portal, so it shifts little by little throughout the year. And so it's important to keep that context in mind. This graph might not exactly match what's on budget on the Galaxy portal today because that budget data is being constantly updated. Also here, you can also think about how COVID stimulus is affecting this curve overall. As I mentioned, we noted that there's a more rapid increase between 2020 and 2021 compared to 2019 to 2020. And so that could be potentially attributed to COVID stimulus money. And so that's another factor that we can begin to think about when we look at this kind of curve. And so here, one of the great things about our dashboard is that there's a lot of interactive features. And so for this particular graph, we have a hover tooltip feature where you're able to hover over different points on the line to do a more detailed data exploration. You can see here as we hover, we can see the specific fiscal year and actual numbers that are on the graph here. And so that's really great if you're interested in diving into a little bit more detail as you look at this first figure. And so moving along to our next figure here, once again, looking at M125 as a case study. This figure is looking at allocations and budget, so that same data once again, but here we have it scaled to the per pupil level. So that means we're taking those total allocations and budget numbers and dividing them by school enrollment to help recontextualize our data as dollars per student, as opposed to just a big net value. And so this per pupil calculation is really important for allowing us to think about how a particular school might compare to other schools, regardless of their size. We know that if one school is much bigger than another school, they'll probably have a greater budget. But it's a little bit more interesting to think about how that budget really boils down to the per student level. It's a little bit more humanizing and gives us a bit more context for what the actual school and classroom type environment is there. And so here, once again, pointing to the legend as we begin to explore this graph, we can see we have school allocations per pupil and school budget per pupil visualized in blue. And then we also here have an additional two lines that are looking at the New York City average numbers that are visualized in gray. And so here we're contextualizing the school level allocations and budget per pupil by the New York City averages to understand a little bit more about how this particular school is relating to the overall city average. It is important to note that every school is different. Every school has a different student body. And so this average is not a perfect comparison or contextualization, but it is worth considering to think about how your school is falling relative to others. And then next here, once again, we have a review of the axes, similar axes, or the same axes to the first figure. On our x-axis, we have the fiscal year from 2018 to 2024. And then on our y-axis, we also have amount in USD, but here representing total allocations and budget per pupil. So you'll notice that the scale here is very different than on that first graph. We have from 14,000 to 20,000 versus a scale in the millions. And so next, beginning to think about what the shape of this line means. And so thinking about the slope here. So in this case, slope is representing shifts in allocations and budget per year, but with consideration for enrollment changes. We're thinking about rates of increase and decrease in allocations and budget, but relative to student body numbers. So we have one example of that here. If you remember from the first line, every single period of years was increasing that first line. But here we see that between 2019 and 2020, our curve is decreasing, which means that in this case, enrollment growth was likely outpacing funding growth. And so that means even though the overall line was increasing from that first graph, here our per pupil graph is declining because the per pupil amount of money is not as great as it was in 2019 and 2020. And so that's a little bit of representation of how this graph is different from that first graph, is that it's allowing us to see a little bit more granularity as we think about the data. And so at a high level, this graph is allowing us to see funding shifts and budget shifts relative to student enrollment. And it allows us to begin to think about how changing student enrollment as well as changing student needs is impacting per pupil funding. For instance, if you have an additional set of students and they have a particular set of needs, they might be introducing a new kind of funding to address those needs when they're coming to a particular school. So it's important to always remember that this data is all within a holistic context of student body enrollment and needs. And so once again, showing what this graph looks like on our actual dashboard, we have similar interactive features here to that first graph. We have the ability to hover over any of these 4 lines and see what those actual numbers are, whether that be for the particular school or for the New York City average lines. And moving along to the next figure, our third figure here is focused specifically on allocations and allocation categories. So allocations are broken up into various categories that specify the rigidity of their funding. So for instance, certain allocations groups can be spent on anything a school wants to spend them with, but other allocation groups are inflexible and schools are required to spend that money in a specific way. And so it's really important to understand what your funding structure looks like to think about how that money is actually being spent. Are there requirements or contingencies on how that money has to be spent? And so that allows us to understand what the wiggle room for the SLTs to think about here is. And so here we've grouped our allocation into 9 different categories. And so we're in this graph showing what the breakdown of total allocation is. What amount of allocation is attributed to FSF versus pre-K versus IEP funding, and so on and so forth. And so to jump into a little bit more specificity with what those allocation categories actually are, to provide a little bit more context, our first 5 allocation categories are mixed funding type allocation categories. The first of these is FSF, or Fair Student Funding, which is the largest portion of allocations money or funding, and it is based on a weighted pupil funding model that considers enrollment and student needs. The second is IEP, or Individualized Education Program, and this amount of money, this type of money, supports special education for students with disabilities. The third kind of funding is pre-K. This is New York City Department of Education allocated funding for specifically early childhood education. So you're more likely to see this funding in an elementary school versus a high school. And then we have NYSTL funding, which is state funding for textbooks, library books, computer software, and hardware. And then finally, we have an other category here. We weren't able to pull out every single kind of funding that exists. And so our other category includes things like stimulus funding, gifted and talented programs, and everything else that's not its own specific category in this case. And our other side of the allocation categories are federal funding types, specifically Titles 1 through 4. And so you might be a little bit familiar with some of these, but the later ones are a little bit less common. So Title I is funds from the U.S. Department of Education that are based on low-income student numbers and are used to provide supplemental services for academically at-risk students. Title II is specifically focused on improving the quality of teachers and principals and decreasing class sizes. So decreasing pupil to staff ratios. Title III is funds for limited English proficient supplemental services and enhanced immigrant student instructional opportunities. So this would include extended day programming, personnel support, family and parent programs, and other things within this specific area. And Title IV is focused on placing school-based community coordinators to support students in temporary housing and provide additional funds for community schools that are considered extraordinary high levels of need as identified by the New York State. And so jumping back to this graph now that we've established what the allocation categories are, Let's take a look at our axes here once again. They are the same as in the other two graphs. We have fiscal year on our x-axis from 2018 to 2024. And then once again, amount in USD on the y-axis, here representing the total allocations category amounts. And here you can see we do have it scaled from 0 to 5 million to represent the distribution and breakdown of school allocation funding. So overall, this graph allows us to see funding shifts over time based on student enrollment and needs. And this segmentation is allowing us to understand where money is coming from and also how flexibly it can be spent depending on that specific source. So similarly to our first two figures, we have that same interactive hover tooltip that allows us to explore the data. Additionally, here you'll notice that we have the ability to see what the specific allocation category is when you hover. Each hover tooltip has specific category descriptions. If you're not sure what a specific funding category is, that information is right there for you. And then another cool feature about this particular graph is that there's the ability to filter the data in real time on the dashboard. So here you can see if you're interested in one specific category, you're able to just visualize that category one at a time. And so you do that by clicking and selecting keep only. And then when you want to undo it, you hit Control or Command plus Z on your keyboard, depending if you're on a Windows or Mac machine, and you're able to reset the figure and start over if you want to filter to view a different category. And similarly, you're able to exclude categories if you want to focus your view a little bit here. Here in the example, I've excluded the other category to focus just on the specifically stated categories on the dashboard. And once again, you're able to select the category, hit exclude, and then when you want to undo it, use the same Control or Command plus Z on your keyboard to undo that filtering. And then here we have our fourth figure, which is looking at pupil to staff ratio. And so this number is calculated by dividing the total enrollment at a school by the total staff enrollment, which includes teachers, paraprofessionals, and leadership. And so these are the specific staff members that are stated on your budget, on your Galaxy budget in the portal. And so we've pulled those numbers from the Galaxy budget portal and then combined that with enrollment data in order to create this specific figure. So picking apart this figure a little bit once again, you can see in our legend, we have a line for school in blue and then a line for the New York City average in gray. And so both of these lines are representing the ratio of students to staff. And so we've contextualized the school level line once again by a New York City average, so we can think about how our school level staffing trends are comparing to citywide staffing trends here. So taking a look now at our axes, a little bit different here. We once again do have fiscal year on our x-axis from 2018 to 2024. But on our y-axis, we have pupil to staff ratio, which is the ratio of students per staff member, like I said, including teachers, paraprofessional leaderships, and anyone else who's represented on our Galaxy budget. So as we begin to pick apart this graph, we're able to identify a few different trends here. It's important to note that in this case, a lower ratio is indicating a favorable school environment. It's better to have less students per staff member. That increases classroom attention and overall quality of education. So we can see here that at the citywide level, we have a general downward trend over time. The ratio of pupil to staff is decreasing, which is a good thing. And then if we compare that to our school level line, overall, M125 has lower pupil to staff ratios than New York City at large. And then if we look at specific moments in this graph from 2018 to 2019, we see a decrease in pupil to staff ratio. So this likely indicates that staff hiring is potentially outpacing student enrollment. The student body could be growing, but if staff is growing to a higher degree, your ratio will increase or decrease, sorry. And then in the inverse, your ratio increases if student enrollment is outpacing staff hiring. So more students are being added to the student body than staff are being added to the school. And so in that case, your ratio would increase. And so overall, this graph is showing one aspect of school budget spending because these types of staff members are allocated in the Galaxy budget. And it is an indicator of school classroom and campus environments, perhaps to a larger degree than the first three, because we're able to think about here what the actual classroom is feeling like depending on the ratio of students to staff. And so here, once again, we have that hover tooltip, and so we're able to scroll over the graph and visualize what those specific numbers are within our chart. And so before I move on to the next two figures, which are at the district level, wanted to pause here and see if there are any questions from the audience about any of these four figures or anything that we've covered thus far. There's a question in the chat from Anna. Does city level include all school levels? Yes. Or is your question about the average? The average does include all school levels. The New York City average is an average of all schools in New York City. And so it's not specific to a specific school level, for instance, elementary, middle, or high school. We do have that functionality within the comparison figures that I'm about to dive into a little bit more. If anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can answer them now or later. For now, I'll just keep moving through to the next few figures. And once again, feel free to throw your questions in the chat at any point, and at the end, we can dive back or scroll back to whatever slides they could be relevant to. Okay, so moving ahead here, like I said, now we're going to dive into district figures. Here we're focusing on the M125 district, so geographic district 5, and specifically focusing on elementary schools in that district so that we have a comparable set of schools. And so at a high level, we want to talk about some trade-offs between these two types of graphs. The first four graphs that we've already covered are at the school level. And so we're looking at trends over time because we're visualizing from 2018 to 2024. We can see how funding or whatever the specific graphs item of interest is changing over time. We're able to see a very granular and detailed exploration of these numbers. And in some cases, we have a very high city level average. So that average is including all schools in the city. And now shifting to district level figures, we're able to compare schools that are in the same geographic district and of the same type. So elementary, middle, or high schools, depending on their categorization. And so here we have two specific charts that I'm going to dive into to discuss these comparison level figures that enable us to understand how our school is relating to other schools of similar geographic and typology. So this first figure is looking at pupil allocations and budget at the district level to allow for comparison. And so here we're looking once again at the per pupils number. So we're taking the total allocations and budget and dividing it by total enrollment for a school. So the first thing to note here is that this is just for 2024. Our school level figures are looking at a set of years from 2018 to 2024, versus here we're just looking at one singular year as we do this comparison. Second thing, taking a look at our legend here, we're looking at allocations and budget per pupil. And so once again, looking at this data at the per pupil level allows us to do a little bit of cross comparison with regard for enrollment differences. We're thinking about dollars per student, and so we can think a little bit less about total school size and how that's affecting net budget because we're scaling this down to a per pupil level. And so here we're looking specifically at elementary schools in NYC Geographic District 5, because that is the set of schools that M125, our case study, exists within. So here I've highlighted M125 to show how we can think about this school as it relates to the others in its like area and typology. So here we're considering how funding and spending at one school are comparing to similar schools. And so I've drawn a line here, and so we can begin to think about how it's relating to this set of schools, right? So we're thinking about, I'm noticing that there are schools that have significantly more per pupil funding, as well as similar amounts. And so once again, very important to note here that every school is different. Every school has students with distinct needs. And so these differences are likely as a result of it. So it's important to contextualize these numbers with research and understanding of the actual student needs and enrollment levels at a school. But nevertheless, this is an interesting way to begin to think about and begin to probe some of those important questions about how funding is being allocated and distributed. And so similarly for this figure, we have some cool interactive features. And so you're able to hover and view specific information about the different schools and their numbers You can highlight if you're interested specifically in allocations or budget, and really explore this data in a little bit more detail as you compare different schools. And so now moving on to our next figure at the district level. Here we're focused on allocation categories comparisons. And so this is similar to our fourth school level figure, except here we're looking at all of the schools breakdowns within a district. And so once again, here we're focused just on 2024's data rather than looking at all of the data over time. We're once again focusing on these 9 specific allocation categories that we've pulled out, and we're able to see how the breakdowns of funding are within each specific school within a district and compare a specific school of interest to like ones around it. And so here, once again, taking a look at how M125, our case study school, is related to schools around it, we can think about how this funding structure is unique or alike to other schools. I'm noticing that all of the schools have a lot of their funding from FSF, which makes sense. We know that that's the major source of allocation for New York City schools. But I'm also noticing here that M125 has pre-K funding and also quite a bit of IEP funding, especially as we compare it to other schools around it, which is interesting. And then also noting that M125 doesn't have as much Title I funding as some of the schools around it. And so that's just an example of how you can begin to think about how your school is unique in terms of funding and ask questions about where the funding is coming from and how it's being spent ultimately. So once again, here we have some cool hover tooltip functionalities. You're able to hover over different parts of the graph and learn more about the allocation category, learn more about the data, learn more about the specific school that's being represented. And this allows us to explore our data in a bit more detail. And then next year, similar to our fourth school level graph, we're able to filter and exclude data to explore certain allocation categories of interest. Here we filtered it just to explore FSF, and then we can also exclude other, like I did in the school level figure. And this allows us to do a lot of really interesting comparison analysis. So for instance, as I was saying, I noticed that M125 has more IEP funding. And so we could filter all of the schools if we wanted to just to look at IEP funding and think about how that's different between different schools within this district at the elementary school level. Okay, so we're heading toward the end of our presentation here. So once again, feel free to put any questions about any of the figures in the chat. But for now, I'll highlight some key high-level takeaways. So reviewing school allocations and budgets is essential to ensuring finances are aligned with schools' needs and goals, as Ashley was discussing early on in the presentation. This is really, really important for SLTs to make sure that finances are aligned with whatever the school's goals and missions are. This dashboard is a free public resource to explore your school's data. As I mentioned, we have 4 school level analysis graphs, those 2 district level comparison graphs, a school lookup code table if you need to know your code in order to access the specific graphs, and then a resource guide and key terms dictionary if you're interested in learning more about one specific aspect of the dashboard or looking more into the DOE's resources in terms of budget and allocations data. The Beta NYC team is always happy to answer any questions you have, whether that be now if you have a specific question or later on. We are always available for contact and happy to have conversations about any of this work with you. We also do radars, which are research and data assistance requests, and that's how, as Anna mentioned, this project started out. And so if there's something specific you're interested in, we're always happy to work with you and would love to hear from you if you have any specific questions or queries. And so here we've provided the link to the dashboard. So please go on there and explore your school's data. And if you have any feedback or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. We also have a user feedback survey right here. We would love to get your insights on how the dashboard is useful to you or ways that it could be improved to be even more useful to you and your needs. And so we would really appreciate if you were able to fill that out. As Ashley mentioned, we also have made the raw data behind the dashboard available. This is the data that was scraped from the Galaxy portals and is now in CSV format, which is easy to download and open in Excel if you want to do any specific analysis, if you're a little bit more data savvy or interested. And so we provided that link here as well. And then our last slide here is just the QR code for our radar program. And so if you're interested in anything specific in this realm or in other realms, feel free to submit a radar. We have the link here as well as the QR code. And Ashley also threw the link to the dashboard in the chat. Thank you, Ashley. And so, yeah, at this point, happy to open the floor for any questions. Would love to hear any insights or feedback or anything anyone has to share.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. Very informative. So we're now going to open up the floor for any questions or comments. I'm actually going to pause at this time the video just so that we can post it, and we don't like to post things that have schools information. So I'm going to pause the video.
Were limitations. There were limitations in working with the Galaxy portal data. You could only search one school at a time for one particular year. And to get a broader breadth and understanding of how one school's budget compares to another. Yeah, like our team, so Eric built a web scraper to make that data available for like this broader tool. So again, like as Audrey mentioned, is that second link on the screen if you want to download that spreadsheet and play with the data yourself if you're Excel savvy or data savvy. That is available and open to the public in an easier format to work with than maybe just the Galaxy portal itself.
I don't think we have any more questions. Just let's try one more time. I don't see no hands raised. So I'm going to thank you for your presentation tonight. We will, the presentation has been recorded. We will be putting it on our YouTube page. And we probably going to send it out to a broader mailing list so that folks that couldn't join tonight have an opportunity to go back and review it. I'm going to ask everyone that is on tonight to please fill out the survey to provide your feedback on any questions, or if there's any questions that come up, as you're going through the tool or using it, please feel free to reach out with your questions. But thank you again tonight. Thank you, Anna. And I know Stacy's not here, but thank you also, Stacy, for picking this initiative up a couple of years ago. And thank you for your presentation tonight. And we look forward to continue working with you on future projects.
Thank you. It was great to share this project, and we'd love to hear your feedback.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.